I never imagined that at 73 years old, I would finally learn the difference between being loved and being used. The morning I decided to change, everything started like any other. I was sitting in my small kitchen, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, while staring at another bank statement that made my stomach clench. Another month of transfers, another dwindling balance, another step closer to having nothing left to give. But that morning felt different somehow, like the air before a storm when everything goes still and you know something big is coming. For the past 4 years, since my husband passed away, I had been living in what I thought was a beautiful dance of family support. My daughter and her husband had convinced me to sell our family home after the funeral, explaining gently that it was too big for me alone, too full of memories that might make my grief harder to bear. They helped me find a modest apartment across town and took care of all the paperwork when I handed over most of the sale proceeds to help them buy their dream house. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. They had young children who needed space to grow. They had careers that required a certain address, a certain image. They promised that the money was just temporary help, that they would pay me back once his business took off. I believed them because I needed to believe them, because the alternative was admitting that my only child saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding. The request had started small and reasonable. Could I help with the down payment on their new house? Of course. What grandmother wouldn't want to help secure her grandchildren's future? Could I co-sign a small business loan? Naturally, I wanted to support my son-in-law's entrepreneurial dreams. Could I cover their mortgage for just a few months while his startup found its footing? Absolutely, family helps family. But small requests had a way of growing into larger ones, and temporary help had a way of becoming permanent dependence. Before I knew it, I was covering not just their mortgage, but their car payments, their credit card bills, their children's private school tuition, their family vacations, their country club membership. Every month brought a new crisis, a new opportunity, a new reason why they needed just a little more help to get back on their feet. I had become their personal banking system, and they had become very skilled at making withdrawals while never making deposits. Not financial deposits, anyway. They were generous with their presence when they needed something, warm with their affection when a payment was due, attentive with their concern when I hesitated to write another check. My daughter would call me several times a week during these periods, asking about my health, sharing news about the grandchildren, making plans for family dinners. But I began to notice that these loving calls always seemed to come right before the rent was due or right after an unexpected expense had arisen. The correlation was so consistent that I started to dread seeing her name on my phone screen. The grandchildren, my precious grandchildren, had become unwitting weapons in this financial warfare. When I expressed concern about my dwindling savings, my daughter would remind me about their upcoming school events, their need for new clothes, their dreams of summer camp. When I hesitated to cover another emergency expense, she would mention how much the children loved their house, their neighborhood, their friends. How devastating it would be for them if anything changed. I found myself living in a constant state of anxiety, checking my bank balance obsessively, calculating how long my savings would last at the current rate of depletion. I stopped buying myself new clothes, stopped going out to eat, stopped taking the small trips I had planned for my retirement. Every dollar I saved was a dollar I could give to them, and every dollar I spent on myself felt like theft from my grandchildren's future. My social life had shrunk to almost nothing. Friends from my working days had drifted away as I consistently declined invitations to movies, restaurants, or weekend trips. How could I explain that I couldn't afford a $20 movie ticket when I was paying for my daughter's family's $5,000 vacation? How could I admit that I was choosing between my medication and their mortgage payment? I had become isolated not just financially but emotionally. My conversations with my daughter were dominated by their needs, their problems, their dreams. When I tried to share my own feelings, my loneliness, my fears about the future, she would listen with the patience of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Then she would redirect the conversation back to their latest crisis or opportunity. My son-in-law had perfected the art of making me feel simultaneously essential and inadequate. He would thank me profusely for my help, while somehow making it clear that the help was insufficient. He would praise my generosity while hinting that truly generous people would do more. He would express gratitude for my sacrifices, while suggesting that bigger sacrifices were needed. I started to feel like I was failing them constantly. No matter how much I gave, it was never quite enough to solve their problems permanently. There was always another unexpected expense, another business opportunity that required capital, another crisis that demanded immediate financial intervention. I was running faster and faster on a treadmill that never stopped moving, never allowed me to catch my breath. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I had just transferred my last $2,000 to cover their mortgage payment, leaving me with barely enough to pay my own rent and utilities. My arthritis was acting up from the cold weather, and I was sitting in my apartment with the heat turned down to save money, wearing a sweater and wrapped in a blanket. My daughter called, as she always did after receiving a transfer, to thank me and update me on family news. But this time, something in her voice was different. There was an edge of frustration, almost irritation, as she explained that the money hadn't been quite enough to cover everything they needed. Could I possibly help with just a little more? When I explained that I had already given them everything I could spare, that I was struggling to pay my own bills, she sighed in a way that made my heart sink. Then she said something that changed everything between us forever. She said that she understood I was getting older, and that managing money was probably becoming more difficult for me. She suggested, in the kindest possible tone, that maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just signed over my financial power of attorney to her. That way, she could make sure all the bills were paid properly and I wouldn't have to worry about these complicated decisions anymore. The suggestion was presented as a gift, a way to relieve me of burden and stress. But I heard it for what it really was: a request for complete control over what little I had left. A way to eliminate the inconvenience of having to ask for money by simply taking the right to take it. I told her I needed to think about it and hung up the phone. Then I sat in my cold apartment and cried for the first time since my husband's funeral. Not just from sadness, but from a rage so pure and clean that it surprised me with its intensity. The next morning, I called my late husband's attorney, a man who had known our family for decades. I made an appointment to review all of my financial arrangements, all of the loans I had co-signed, all of the ongoing commitments I had made. I told him I wanted to understand exactly where I stood and what my options were. The meeting was enlightening in the most devastating way possible. In 4 years, I had given my daughter's family over $300,000. Not loaned, given. The co-signed loans meant I was responsible for another $150,000 in debt. My retirement savings had been reduced to less than $30,000, barely enough to live on for 6 months. My attorney was gentle, but clear about my situation. I was on track to be completely destitute within a year if the current arrangement continued. He asked if my daughter and her husband understood the extent of my financial sacrifice, if they had any plans to repay even a portion of what I had given them. I realized I had never actually asked for repayment, had never set boundaries around my giving, had never treated these transfers as loans rather than gifts. I had been so focused on being the good mother, the supportive grandmother, the family member who could always be counted on, that I had forgotten to be the person who valued herself enough to ensure her own survival. That afternoon, I did something I had never done before. I sat down and wrote out a complete accounting of every dollar I had given them, every payment I had made on their behalf, every expense I had covered. The list filled 6 pages and represented nearly my entire life savings. Then I made a series of phone calls to the bank, canceling my automatic transfers and removing my daughter as an authorized user on my accounts. To the credit card companies, removing myself as a guarantor on their cards. To the mortgage company, withdrawing my co-signature on their loan refinancing. To my attorney, drafting new financial documents that protected what little I had left. It took 3 days to untangle 4 years of financial entanglement, but by Friday afternoon, it was done. For the first time in years, my bank account belonged only to me. The first call came Monday morning. My daughter's voice was confused, slightly panicked. There had been some kind of mistake with their mortgage payment. The automatic transfer hadn't gone through. Could I call the bank and fix whatever technical problem was preventing the payment? I told her there was no technical problem. The transfer had been canceled because I could no longer afford to make it. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, more calculating. She asked what I meant. Exactly. And I explained that I had reviewed my finances and realized that I needed to stop supporting them financially in order to survive. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Gone was the loving daughter who called to check on my health and share family news. In her place was someone I barely recognized. Someone who spoke about my obligations to my grandchildren, my responsibility to family, my selfishness in changing the rules without warning. She accused me of manipulating them, of using money to control their choices, of threatening their children's security out of spite. She said that my husband would be ashamed of my selfishness, that I was destroying our family over money that I couldn't take with me anyway. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This person who had been accepting thousands of dollars from me every month was now calling me manipulative. This person who had been making her family's problems my financial responsibility was now calling me controlling. This person who had been spending my retirement savings was now calling me selfish. I hung up on my own daughter for the first time in my life. The next call came from my son-in-law. His approach was different, more businesslike. He explained the bind my decision had put them in, the various financial commitments they had made based on my support. He outlined the consequences they would face if I didn't reconsider. Potential foreclosure, bankruptcy, the children having to change schools. He spoke about family loyalty and mutual obligation. He reminded me of all the times they had included me in holiday celebrations, all the dinners I had been invited to, all the ways they had made me feel like part of their lives. He suggested that pulling my support now, without warning, was a betrayal of the relationship we had built. His tone was reasonable, logical, almost kind, but underneath it was a threat that he probably thought was too subtle for me to catch. If I didn't resume my financial support, I would lose access to my grandchildren. I would be cut off from the only family I had left. I told him I understood the situation perfectly, and that my decision remained unchanged. The campaign that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Phone calls at all hours, voicemails that ranged from pleading to angry to accusatory, text messages about the children's disappointment, about their confusion over why Grandma didn't love them anymore, emails with photos of the grandchildren looking sad, with captions about how much they missed their grandmother. They even enlisted my son-in-law's mother, a woman who had barely spoken to me in 10 years, to call and explain how disappointed she was in my behavior. How could I abandon my family in their time of need? What kind of grandmother would put money ahead of her grandchildren's welfare? The manipulation was so transparent that it might have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. These were people who had been systematically draining my life savings. And now, they were portraying me as the villain for refusing to continue funding their lifestyle. But the worst part was the doubt they managed to plant in my mind. Late at night, lying in my cold apartment, I would wonder if they were right. If I was being selfish? If I was destroying my family over money? If my grandchildren would grow up thinking their grandmother had abandoned them? The doubt lasted until I looked at my bank statements again, until I calculated how many months I could survive on what I had left, until I remembered that I was 73 years old with no source of income except my Social Security and no savings except what little I had managed to protect from their demands. 3 weeks after I cut off their support, they lost the house. I learned about it from a neighbor who had seen the foreclosure notice in the legal section of the newspaper. The same neighbor who had been commenting for months about what a lovely family my daughter had. What a beautiful house they lived in. How lucky I was to have such successful children. Part of me felt sick about it. These were my grandchildren who would have to move, who would have to change schools, who would have to give up the bedrooms and backyard and neighborhood they loved. Part of me wanted to call my daughter, to apologize, to offer whatever help I could provide. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. The constant anxiety about money was gone. The monthly scramble to cover their expenses was over. The phone calls requesting emergency funds had stopped. For the first time in 4 years, my bank balance was going up instead of down. I started doing things I had forgotten I enjoyed. I bought books without calculating whether I could afford them. I turned up the heat in my apartment. I bought groceries without choosing between the generic and name brand options based on price alone. Small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary after years of deprivation. My daughter called 6 weeks after the foreclosure. Her voice different again. Smaller somehow. More vulnerable. She told me they were living in a rental apartment across town, that the children were adjusting to their new school, that she had gotten a job at a local marketing company. She didn't apologize exactly, but she talked about the stress they had been under, the pressure she had felt to maintain a certain lifestyle. She mentioned how her husband's business had failed, how the economy had been difficult, how they had made some poor financial decisions. She talked about our relationship, how much she missed our regular conversations, how much the children asked about me. She wondered if we could start over somehow, if we could rebuild what had been damaged. I listened without making any commitments. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal just because someone needs it to. Love, once weaponized, doesn't automatically become safe again just because the weapon has been put down. But I also listened without anger. These were people who had been drowning financially and had grabbed onto me as a life preserver. The fact that they had been willing to pull me under to save themselves didn't make them monsters. It made them desperate. And desperate people don't always make good choices. 6 months later, we began having coffee together once a month. Careful conversations in neutral territory, both of us learning how to relate to each other without money being part of the equation. She told me about her job, which she was discovering she actually enjoyed. About the challenges of living within their means for the first time in years. About the marriage counseling she and her husband had started. I told her about the art classes I had started taking, about the book club I had joined, about the small trips I was planning, about the volunteer work I had begun doing at the literacy center, about the friends I was making, and the life I was building. We were both different people than we had been during the years of financial entanglement. She was more grounded, more realistic about what life actually cost and what they could actually afford. I was stronger, more protective of my boundaries, less willing to sacrifice my well-being for someone else's comfort. The relationship we were building was smaller than what we had before, but it was also more honest. We talked about things other than money. We made plans that didn't involve financial obligations. We spent time together because we wanted to, not because one of us needed something from the other. My son-in-law and I maintained a polite distance. He was civil when we encountered each other, but we both understood that some relationships, once revealed in their true nature, couldn't be rebuilt on the same foundation. The grandchildren took longer to warm up to me again. They had been told, in age-appropriate ways, that Grandma had been going through some financial difficulties and couldn't help the family the way she used to. They had absorbed, as children do, the emotional undercurrents of their parents' stress and disappointment. But gradually, as I became a regular presence in their lives again, without being their financial support system, they began to relax around me. We found ways to spend time together that didn't cost money. Walks in the park, library visits, baking cookies in my small apartment kitchen. A year and a half after everything changed, I am a different person than I was when this story began. I sleep well at night without worrying about bank balances or upcoming bills. I make plans for my future that belong to me alone. I spend my money on things that bring me joy rather than things that bring others relief from their poor choices. I have learned that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. That saying no doesn't make you selfish, and that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. That real love doesn't come with invoices, and real family doesn't require payment plans. Sometimes people ask if I regret what I did, if I miss the family gatherings and holiday celebrations that became less frequent when the money stopped flowing, if I wish I had handled things differently. I tell them that I miss the family I thought I had, but I don't miss the role I was playing to maintain that illusion. I tell them that I regret not setting boundaries sooner, not protecting myself better, not recognizing the difference between helping and enabling. Most of all, I tell them that I am happier now than I have been in years. Lonelier sometimes, but happier. More myself than I have been since my husband died. I am 75 years old now, and I am finally living my own life. It took me too long to understand that my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice everything for others. That love shouldn't cost everything you have. That family means supporting each other, not one person supporting everyone else. The greatest gift I gave myself wasn't the money I stopped giving them. It was the permission to value myself as much as I had always valued them. To see my future as something worth protecting. To understand that it's never too late to change the story you're living. Today is sunny and warm, and I have plans that belong to me. Tomorrow will be the same, and for the first time in years that feels like enough.